Hello, gathered friends, I'm Roar Nuva, and welcome to Bionicle Deep Dive, where we analyze the tropes, characters, and lore of LEGO Bionicle. In this video, we're going to be asking the question, why exactly was Takua banished from Ta-Koro at the beginning of the series? We were never actually told many of the details of Takua's banishment, only that for some time up until the arrival of the Toa, Takua was treated as an outcast and wasn't welcome in the village. But there are questions that remain about what the exact reason was, who specifically made the decision, and for how long he was banished. And it's something I've always been a bit curious about. So, let's dive right into it and see what clues we can pick up from context. So, let's start with what we know. Most of the information on Takua's banishment comes from Vakama's dialogue in the Matsunui online game. The general consensus within the Bionic community seems to be that Turaga Vakama banished Takua from Ta-Koro. But these interactions make me think otherwise. After all, there's no source that explicitly says Vakama was the one to do it, only that Takua was banished. Now, it makes sense that Vakama would be the one to banish him. Vakama is, after all, the Turaga of the village, and as its elder, he would have the most authority. However, when you look at Vakama's dialogue with Takua in Matsunui online game, Vakama seems to hold a surprisingly high opinion of Takua, and references that is the other Tamatoran he should be careful around. When Takua first talks to Vakama, Vakama comments on how Takua found his way back to them, and that he's brave for doing so. Vakama then goes on to tell Takua to be careful in the city, as there are some who remember him, but also that the villagers may be more patient than usual given that Tahu had just arrived and the village was feeling a surge of hope. Later in their conversation, when Takua asks who Vakama is, Vakama responds surprised, asking if Takua's aimless wandering has caused him to forget everything, including, as Vakama says, his great deeds and also the thing that drove you away from us. Vakama also asks if Takua still had the lava board he gave him. He talks about how lava surfing is a skill unique to the Tamatoran, and says that it would be a shame if Takua had forgotten about it. Vakama gives a little bit more insight into Takua's banishment and their conversation at the end of the game. Vakama comments that, despite the fact that Takua helped many of the Turaga and even Vakama himself in the past, Takua was considered an outcast because of his drive to wander the island for adventure. The people of Ta-Koro didn't trust him, and feared his adventurous ways would bring them bad luck. Vakama notably says they, not we, when talking about the Tamatoran's distrust of Takua. Afterwards, of course, Vakama tells Takua, "You have proven us all wrong," and welcomes him back to the village, certain that Takua will find many friends there after his efforts to save the island. Also, can I just say how genuinely hilarious it is how Takua got his job as chronicler? Because they know he isn't going to stop wandering off. That's what made them banish him in the first place. But he was also too heroic for them to stay mad at, and he had such a weird knack for stumbling onto historically significant events with the Toa that it feels like the islanders just collectively decided, "Okay, Takua, here's the deal. You can come back to the village. We'll even give you a job. You can wander around the island as much as you want, talk to whoever, check out any cool stuff you see. Just make sure you write down any major historical events you happen across." And he was like, "Can do," and proceeded to actually be the best at his job. But anyways, back to the topic of his interactions with Vakama. So, these interactions are interesting, because while they are extremely vague on specific details, they tell us a lot in very few lines about the character of Vakama and Takua's relationship, and some insights into his banishment. So, it's clear that Takua made the other villagers in Ta-Koro angry with his wandering, and they didn't like that he was so irresponsible. Though Vakama still seems to hold Takua in high regard, calling him brave and even saying he did great deeds. Vakama even wants Takua to still consider himself a part of the Tamatoran community even while in exile, as he hopes Takua still carries with him an insider aspect of Ta-Koro culture, lava surfing. Vakama doesn't stop Takua from being in the village, but does refer to potential resentment from the other villagers. And consistently, when referring to Takua's status in the village, Vakama doesn't talk about any personal animosity between him and Takua, but rather talks about how the others in the village feel. These don't feel like the words of an authority figure who wanted Takua banished. And given the later context of all that Vakama went through as a Toa to save his people from Makuta, not even mentioning the fact that he and Takua were good friends as Matoran on Metru Nui, I find it hard to believe that Vakama would ever just throw Takua to the wolves out of frustration. Remember, Takua was banished during the Dark Times, when Makuta ruled over the island, and the villagers were in constant danger from his plagues and infected beasts. The island may have been a paradise, but it was a dangerous one, and casting him out with no village to return to meant he had to face all the dangers alone. Even at his most frustrated, I doubt Vakama would ever personally order that. The other Matoran, however, might. In one of the Chat with Greg dialogues, Greg Farsty implies that some of the other Matoran may have gotten jealous and resentful of Takua for traveling around, and also fearing that he would bring them into danger. They heavily value unity and duty, and going off on your own and ignoring the tasks given to you was frowned upon, Greg said. Especially considering how this life on Motunui was all they ever knew, a life where they all had to pull together to scrape by, they might be less tolerant of Takua because they lack the context for all that was done to get them here safely. And especially when you consider that one of the themes of Minog and early Bionicle was that, despite the Turaga's best efforts, the Matoran as a whole began to lose their values and turn away from reaching out to help one another in favor of a more self-centered preservation. And in that way, turned their back on true unity. And that's why one of the underlying themes of the story is how the heroism of Takua during the game taught all the islanders a lesson in coming together and valuing people who are different. But all that to say, the Tamatoran during the Dark Times would have a much less tolerance and would be much more believable in turning on one of their own if they thought he was a risk. But if the people of Ta-Koro banished him, but Vakama didn't want that, then why didn't Vakama stop them? To put it simply, I don't think he could. The social structure between the Matoran and Turaga on Motunui was much looser than it was on Metrunui. And although the Turaga were still in charge, they clearly take on more of a guiding than ruling role. Matoran are shown openly confronting their Turaga about grievances and defying their instructions, as opposed to on Metrunui, where Turaga Duma held absolute authority. Especially since there were no Vaki, the Turaga had little ability to enforce rules beyond the Matoran simply respecting their wisdom. It's possible that the villagers decided amongst themselves that they were no longer going to tolerate Takua, possibly even against Vakama's wishes, and Vakama was in a position where he couldn't stop them. And it may be that it was not a formal banishment, so much as just most of the people in the town really didn't like him, and he was treated as an outcast, so he stayed away. Though, given that Vakama asks Takua in Minog if he remembers the thing that drove you away from us, it does seem that there was a distinct event that caused the village to be fed up with him and kick him out. Or, I guess given how much he wanders, just not let him back in. Another interesting question with this is, how long was Takua banished for? Truthfully, the answer is we have no answers. There were no direct statements as to how long Takua had been wandering the island on his own. A few lines of dialogue imply that he's been wandering for a long time, though we aren't given anything more specific than that. And since the Matoran were on Motunui for 1,000 years, and the characters are functionally immortal, for all we know he could have been anywhere from several months to hundreds of years. When Takua first comes to Ta-Koro in Minog, Vakama warns him to be careful in the village, as, there are some who remember you. This implies that it has been long enough that not everyone in the village still remembers everything Takua did. In fact, this may imply that some of the Tamatoran don't fully remember who he is. This is largely a consequence of the fact that when the game was made, it was before the details of the Matoran's history and lifespan was hashed out, and so they weren't working on the assumption that every Matoran on the island had been living there for 1,000 years. Some very early concepts even imply they may have had children and multiple generations. Though it's still possible for this to be consistent, as there are other parts of the Bionicle story that might imply that Matoran memory doesn't always keep all the details of their long lifespans, especially given how Makuta damaged their memories. All that to say, it's possible that, after enough time, some of the Matoran genuinely did not remember why Takua was banished, even if they directly witnessed it. In the other villages, the Matoran and Turaga call him the Traveler or the Wanderer, never referring to him as being from Ta-Koro. Given that in stories set after Takua is welcomed back to the village, he is often referred to as Takua of Ta-Koro, we can conclude that at the time of Minog, it was known that Takua was no longer a part of the Fire Village, and that enough time had passed for him to be known simply as the Wanderer. With all that said, we have a lot of wiggle room for speculation about how long Takua was banished for. Personally, I like to think he was banished for a pretty long time, mostly because I like the idea of playing more with their long lifespans. Just logically, what they would think of as a long time and what humans would think of as a long time would probably be a bit different. I like to imagine that Takua was banished for at least several decades, maybe even 1 or 200 years. Long enough to firmly establish himself as the Wanderer among the islanders. Though sometimes I wonder if it would be more interesting to go even longer, perhaps even the majority of the 1,000 years on the island. Of course, if he was banished for so long during the Dark Times, where Makuta and his infected Rahi ruled the island, how could he have survived for so long without a village? And I say the answer is probably 2 reasons. The first is that Takua has been shown to be very resourceful and creative, and we hear many adventures where he managed to survive the dangers on his own. Life outside the villages was dangerous, but not a death trap. Second, is that Makuta's forces were usually more focused on sieging the villages, and I doubt Makuta would have diverted his Rahi to go after him specifically. Sure, they'd go after Takua when they encountered him, but they wouldn't be dedicated to capturing one outcast Matoran when Makuta's real goal was the whole society. Sure, later on, Makuta came to see Takua as a threat, since during the Mask of Light arc, Makuta clearly knows Takua as the 7th Toa. But this is before all that, and before Takua started thwarting his plans at the end of Minog. But maybe if Makuta hadn't dismissed him all that time, he wouldn't have had to worry about all that Toa of Light stuff. Now, what event caused Takua to be banished is again unknown. All we have is that it was likely a time when he wandered off from the village, and it likely had some major consequences that caused the Tamatoran to finally be fed up with him. And this is a purely speculative headcanon, but I may have found something that works as the event that did it. In Dark Destiny, Takanuva and Jaller are talking, and Takanuva remembers a time when he was a Matoran and got lost in a cave in Lewahi, and almost got eaten by stone rats. Jaller had to come find him, and charged into a cave to grab Takua, though they both fell down into a hole into a venomous rockworm nest, and had to dig through a tunnel filled with the remains of its meals to get out. Now, there's no indication of when this event happened, and it could have very easily have happened after Takua was accepted back into Ta-Koro. Heck, given how Takua and Jaller's friendship really took off during and after the Borok arc, it may have happened during the peaceful period while they were training for the Koli tournament. It's not necessarily a perfect fit. However, the reason I bring it up is that if this is what happened, it would make for an interesting story. This was the case where Takua's wandering not only put himself, but others in danger, just like the Tamatoran feared. Takua's curious nature nearly cost them their captain of the guard, someone vital to the safety and protection of their village during the Dark Times. If this happened during that time period, the Tamatoran would be furious with Takua, and would have likely concluded that they would be better off without him. And given the very serious nature of Jaller almost being killed, this might have been why Vakama would finally relent and let the Tamatoran exile Takua. At the same time, it might explain why Jaller does not represent Takua. Jaller cared enough to save him, and they ended up going through it together and relying on each other, which is something Jaller values. And why, after they reunite after Minog, Jaller is not only welcoming to Takua, but even offers him a job in the Ta-Koro guard right off the bat. Also, when we look at the context of why Takanuva and Jaller were talking about it in Dark Destiny, it works even better. They were talking about this on their journey to try and find the Toanuva after they disappeared on Voyanui. Takanuva brought it up because he had a feeling that in spite of how horrible that incident was, it would be nothing compared to the journey to Voyanui, and that Jaller and the other Matoran should turn back, since finding the Toanuva was his job. This was Takanuva trying to take responsibility for this quest and try to ensure that nobody else got hurt because of something he should have taken care of. Perhaps it reminded him of another time when he did act irresponsibly and was forced to deal with the consequences of putting others in danger. Hey, it wouldn't have been the last time Takua failing to take responsibility forced Jaller to rush in and save him. After all, that's what happened during Mask of Light when Jaller sacrificed himself for Takua. And with this interpretation, it adds even more layers to the guilt and shame Takua must feel in the wake of Jala's death. You can't help but wonder if what was going through his head was that the Thomas Horn was right. This is exactly why they banished him. He didn't do his responsibility, and it got someone killed. Which, in turn, may explain why Takanuva then went to face Makuta alone at the end of the movie. In some of the discussion on Tumblr after one of my earlier videos on the layered interaction between Takua and Makuta, some people commented that Takanuva's decision makes a lot more sense if we consider that as racked with grief as he isn't quite thinking straight. Rather, he's trying to go in the polar opposite direction of his previous mistakes, shouldering all the responsibility on himself alone and confronting his problems in a way he thinks Jaller or a proper Toa would. This is kind of a tangent, but all that to say, there is a thematic pattern that fits if this known incident of Takua wandering off and putting Jaller in danger is the incident that caused the people of Ta-Koro to no longer welcome him in the village. So, let's recap what we know and what we suspect about Takua's banishment. Takua was cast out from Ta-Koro due to his wandering nature, making the other villagers mistrust him. From his interactions with Vakama, it seems like it wasn't actually Vakama who banished him, but rather he was kicked out by the rest of the villagers. And given that Takua was still able to enter the village in Minog, it may have been a less formal of a banishment and more of him simply no longer being welcome in town. We have little to go on about how long he had been an outcast, but it's implied to be long enough for some people to forget, and for the other villages to know him as the Wanderer, so clearly a long time. Due to the timescale of how the characters work, I like to headcanon it as something like a couple hundred years, but that's just me. And based only on me thinking it's thematically fitting, I'm headcanoning that the time where Takua and Jala got stuck in a cave in Lewahi was the incident that got him banished from the village. That's honestly the best incident I know of that fits, though it could easily be something else, and honestly makes for some very good fanfic potential. It's always nice when stories give space for fans to be inspired. But that's my analysis on Takua's banishment from Ta-Koro. What do you guys think? Do you like my headcanons, or do you have your own ideas for these questions? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you guys soon. Take care, my gathered friends.